Hi, this is Peter Woolfolk. With 2022 behind us, let me say thank you so very, very much. First, to all of our great guests that provide the exceptional content for this podcast, and to our ever-growing number of listeners and supporters of the Public Relations Review podcast. At the close of 2022, we now have listeners in over 2,000 cities located in 123 countries around the world. Here in the U.S., this podcast has been voted one of the best PR podcasts in America. Because we continue to provide skilled professionals that can present you with excellent content on a wide range of PR topics and the large listener downloads of usable information we deliver, this podcast was awarded a Best PR Podcast trophy from the Nashville chapter of the Public Relations Society of America. We have also won a Best Business Podcast trophy from the American Business Association. I will continue to seek some of the best professionals from all across America and a few from foreign nations to bring you the kind of professional information that is useful to your business and to expand your knowledge about public relations. These professionals are delighted to share this information with you, and it appears from our continued growth that you enjoy listening to them. So once again, thank you so very much for being a listener. Please let your friends and colleagues know about the Public Relations Review podcast. We are available on Amazon, Apple, Audible, Spotify, Google, iHeart, and another 30 or more sites, making us available worldwide. So thank you. And now on to the podcast.
Welcome. This is the Public Relations Review podcast, a program to discuss the many facets of public relations with seasoned professionals, educators, authors, and others. Now, here is your host, Peter Woolfolk.
Welcome to the Public Relations Review podcast and to our listeners all across America and around the world. Now, question. What is required for PR professionals to be successful at international communications and working remotely? Well, my guest today is a dynamic public relations practitioner with several years of international experience. She is passionate about how to connect and build relationships with people of various cultures. She has worked in Frankfurt, Germany, London, England, Salt Lake City, and other cities in the United States. She currently works as corporate communications supervisor at DigiCert, managing corporate communications in Europe, their global blog, and social media. Now, in addition, she is pursuing her APR in the spring 2023 cohort and recently completed a master's degree in international business and communication at Oxford Brookes University. She is a graduate of Brigham Young University, where she also served as the president of PRSSA. Joining me today from London, England, is Amelia Meckham. So, Amelia, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me.
So, tell me let's talk about your journey. What steps did you take? What led you to get into this international communications? Your progress from your graduation from Brigham Young to now being there at DigiCert.
Right. So, when I was in my undergrad at Brigham Young University, I was very interested in studying abroad. And I did a few different study abroads and then culminated in my internship in Frankfurt, where I was able to work in Germany for a summer. And that international experience really got me interested in learning more about working in different cultures. And I came back to university and finished with a minor in global management. And then from there, I kind of knew that I wanted to get back into working and living in another culture. So I was reaching out to find out different resources. And keep in mind, this was also right in the middle of the pandemic hit as I was looking to move over here. So definitely a big challenge there. But I found a great service called Across the Pond, and they help connect students in the U.S. to universities in the U.K. And from there, I was able to narrow down my list to Oxford Brookes, knowing that I wanted to study international business and intercultural communication, and kind of enabled the lifestyle that I wanted of living in a different culture, learning and being immersed in it. I studied different culture theory along with business and communication, and now living in. So what I completed, I moved over with DigiCert. While I was doing my master's, I was able to work with the company here. I was working for them in Salt Lake City, and luckily they had an office here that I was able to transfer to. And I've completed my master's, but now I'm staying over here in London. And while I'm over here, I have been working specifically with our PR agency based in London, and we've developed sort of a wheel and spoke model. We're a pretty small communications team, but we cover globally. We cover 4 regions: North America, Latin America, Europe, APAC, Japan. And so our model for that is we have an agency of record here in London that I coordinate with, and then our agency in London coordinates with smaller bespoke agencies in local countries. So we have contacts in France, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, etc., and we're able to be more agile and reach more cultures that way. So even though we're a small team, it's important to us that we have people on the ground, local PR people, who are actually immersed in the culture, natives, have relationships with the journalists there, and able to do what they need.
Mm-hmm.
And I think go ahead.
No, I was about to ask you just what sort of business is DigiCert in?
DigiCert is a leading provider of digital trust. We offer products that help secure digital communications. And that could be everything from websites to devices, users and authentication, digital document signing, etc.
Mm-hmm. So how long have you been in London now?
I've been living here for a year and a half.
Okay. Now that you've had this experience, what are the significant differences that you've experienced in terms of how communications or public relations is handled? Or is there any significant difference?
Yeah, I would say there are some minor differences. So if we look at culture theory, for instance, culture is always on a scale. It's always comparing one culture to another culture. And on a global scale, the U.S. and the U.K. are actually quite similar compared to most countries. And culture theory was kind of led by Gert Hofstede, who came out with several culture scales. But one of my favorites, Erin Meyer, she has developed a little bit more on Hofstede's theories, and she has 8 different scales that we can use to measure culture. One of them is communication, one is feedback, thinking, leadership, decision-making, trust, how we disagree, and how we view time. So I'll focus on communication because I think that's most relevant for PR practitioners. But it is worth looking into the other scales of culture as well. The communication can either be low context or high context. Low context communication is very straightforward. It can be seen as very blunt. Basically, the words that we say are exactly what we need. Mm-hmm. High context communication, on the other hand, is a little bit more nuanced. There's a lot more meaning in how something is said and the body language of it, for instance. High context cultures are often thought of in Asian cultures, whereas low context is often thought of in, Dutch culture. They can be known as very blunt. The U.S. is pretty low context. So in general, Americans prefer to communicate directly. Mm-hmm. The UK is a little bit more high context, though, than the US is. Some of the Brits prefer a little bit less direct. For instance, they might say something like, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I'm not sure how I feel about it. What they really mean is, I think what you're saying is ridiculous. I completely disagree. Okay. So there's a little bit more translation, to the Brits. Their form of communication can be a little bit confusing at first for Americans who are used to very direct style of communication. But that's why it's so important, I think, to have people in a local culture to partner with people who are native. So even though I've studied, I have 2 degrees now where I've studied culture theory, and I lived and immersed myself in the local culture, I still am not able to pick up all the nuances as if I was able to live and be a native of that culture. So that's why we partner with local agencies.
That makes a lot of sense to me when you say cultural differences. Probably last year sometime, I did a podcast on how to market to Asian Americans. And the fellow Michael Soon Lee, who actually did that, he said that's hugely important, that people need to understand the culture first, and they need to understand it from people who are actually involved in it, rather than thinking that, you can do things there or with that group the way you do with the U.S. And if you don't, you can have some very serious unintended consequences, and the wheels just might completely come off of your campaign.
Yeah, and I'll give you a really famous example of that, Disney Paris. So when Disney Parks decided to launch in Europe, they selected Paris as the location because it was fairly central and often trafficked by tourists. But when they launched Disney Paris back in the day, they didn't consider all the cultural nuances that they should have. Because they had previously launched Disney in Tokyo, and it had gone over really well there. And so they thought, we can just copy and paste the Disney park from, California, Tokyo to Paris, and it should go well, right? Well, no, it didn't. It actually went terribly. The local French people really rejected the idea of Disneyland. It wasn't their idea of fun to spend all day in line or to eat their food on the go like Americans do. The French prefer a sit-down meal. And additionally, when the French go on vacation, they prefer like south of France.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a multi-million-dollar mistake that Disney made by launching in Paris without considering this. Eventually, they were able to, I think, partner with somebody local in the culture to understand those changes that they needed to make, adding in more restaurants, adding in more languages, so things were in French rather than English first. And now Disney Paris is doing fine. But, even the big companies like Disney have gotten this wrong in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, that happens to quite a few people, even locally, that you can go from one culture to another and think that one size fits all. And that's a huge, huge area that hopefully people have come to grips with right now and see that there is need to have somebody from that particular culture to guide you along the way, just to prevent you from completely ripping your shorts, trying to get something done. No, I was going to ask you, what has been the biggest hurdle that perhaps you have begun to, that you had to climb and to reach a level of comfort there?
My biggest hurdle to reaching a level of comfort here in the UK, I would say probably building up that community. Whenever you make a big move internationally, it can be very jarring. But it was especially hard, I think, because I moved in 2021 now. So that was right still in the pandemic, and there was still some lockdown happening. But through, networking, through meeting other people and mingling with locals, that I was able to build a community, not just of other Americans here or other Brits here, but lots of people from all different cultures all over the world. And that's one thing I really appreciate about London, is that, yes, there are a lot of British and there are a lot of other Americans, but it really is a melting pot from all over.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I think pretty unique. Well, you find that in most big cities, but creating that community, I think, has been important to me. One of my personal goals is to travel to 100 different countries. And I love meeting people from all over the world so I can get different recommendations, different views of their culture and how they view things. And so I just recently hit 30 countries that I've traveled to. I'm almost a third of the way there.
Well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it because it was years ago, but I've also spent maybe about a week in London, but also lived in Germany for a while, and got a chance to get down to Austria, things like that. So it's just fascinating to be able to travel around. The other thing I found, you mentioned being in Germany, one of the things I found over there was very quickly that most Germans speak English. And the caveat is if they want to, because if they don't like you, they won't speak English. But most Europeans can speak two languages, and English is certainly one of them.
Yeah, I would say we are at quite an advantage, and that is something I have recognized. A lot of privilege of being native English speaking, being American. We're able to travel pretty freely and go somewhere, and it's a safe assumption that the majority of people will speak English. That's definitely, I think, a privilege that we have. I love travel, and like I said, I think it's important for everyone to get out, and that's because it's hard to appreciate and understand your own culture if you've never experienced and seen other ones. There's a great metaphor of culture is kind of like a fish in water. For everyone outside of that water, it's very obvious that the fish is swimming in water. But for the fish itself, if you asked it what water is, it would be like, I don't know. That's how culture is, you know?
Mm-hmm.
If you ask someone who's always lived in that water and always in that culture their whole life to describe their culture, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to do so. But if I ask you, for instance, to describe German culture after your visit to Germany, you'd be able to say, oh, well, you know, they do things differently. Their time is so important to them. They're much more on time than Americans, and their communication is even more direct than we are in America. And you can notice those when you leave the fish out of water, for instance. You can notice those things easier.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to the PR side of things over there, even though you work with an agency, in terms of, have you had an opportunity to see how they go about pitching a news release or dealing with reporters over there or through your agency? Is there any significant differences how it's handled there as compared to here?
I'm not really sure if there's any significant differences. There has been a lot of change, I think, in recent years, and this is not unique to over here, but just because we're seeing fewer and fewer journalists on staff, and they're expecting to put out more and more content per person. So the workload on the journalists is heavier than ever before. And that is something that we are very mindful of over here in Europe as well, especially because there may be one journalist covering all of the UK or all of one of our specific markets, at least in the tech trade publications that we work with. So we just are always trying to be very mindful of their workload. But I don't know that is necessarily unique to Europe versus the U.S. Okay.
Now, you had also mentioned some experience working remotely. What are the differences in your remote work that you, or what have been your experiences as you work remotely?
Yeah, so I'll admit personally, I love remote work. I do work hybrid currently, 2 days a week in person and 3 days a week remote, which I think is a great balance. But actually, for my dissertation, I studied this exact topic because I was watching over here in the UK this movement during the pandemic of the Great Resignation, and I wanted to understand impact that remote work and this, reevaluation of work-life balance was leading to the Great Resignation. And also, I have a bit unique perspective because I would say that work-life balance over here in the UK and in Europe in general is a little bit more work fits into life, not life fits into work. And I would say American culture in general, obviously this is generalization, not for everyone, but in general, Americans put work at a higher priority. Mm-hmm. There was some video circling around during the pandemic about jokes about this. You'd see like an American out of office notices, I'm out of office, I'm in the hospital, but I will be back in the office in 2 hours, versus the Europeans in all of August, you're like, you basically can't catch any of them because they're all on holiday for 2-3 weeks at a time at the beach, and they just say, I will delete all my emails when I come back. So it's a very different approach to work life. So having said that, when I was approaching my dissertation, I wanted to understand the work-life balance and how remote work fit into that. I found some really interesting insights. So I used my company as a case study and met with a lot of different people to understand their motivation for work during the pandemic. And a lot of people talk about the pandemic as this great reset button. It was basically an opportunity for them to reevaluate their priorities, their values in life, and a lot of them decided that they wanted, different things out of work and different things out of life. Some of that came a little bit of generational insight. So Gen Z was widely entering the labor market during the pandemic. So a lot of them, Gen Z, entered the labor market with remote work in place. And I think the future of remote work will have a lot to do with their generation and their attitudes towards remote work. Will they want to continue it? Will they want to go back to fully in person? What will their attitudes be? And studies right now are showing that across different generations, the majority of workers estimate spending the majority of their work week remote. So I think hybrid work is still a very big part of the conversation and probably the best solution we have right now, but it could change in the future. And there's a couple of things at play there as well. And I don't want to say that work-life balance was the only thing that was affecting the Great Resignation during the pandemic, because there were a lot of factors at play there. One other interesting factor at play was the labor market switching in bargaining power from the employer having a lot of bargaining power to the employee. And the reason that happened was because of the supply demand. For once in a long time in history, suddenly there was a lot of demand for labor, but less supply. And the reason for that is, various. People were exiting the workforce, deciding to retire. People were, moving abroad. People were taking their side hustles full time and becoming entrepreneurs, leaving corporate America, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly there was all this demand for labor and low supply. And basic economics, anyone who has done Econ 101 can understand with supply demand. It created this unique labor market where employees had the upper hand in negotiations. But they weren't just negotiating for higher salaries. They were also negotiating for better working conditions. So if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once those salary negotiations are met, then they're looking for higher level needs to be met. So they're looking for the opportunity to grow in their career, learning and development opportunities, flexible working conditions, that better work-life balance. And I really kind of boiled that down to the top 3 factors that I kept hearing over and over again from my interviewees. And those top 3 were the better compensation, possibility of growth, and flexible working conditions. And I think that in this post-pandemic world, if employers are looking to better retain their employees, to better attract new employees, those 3 factors are going to be key for them to focus on.
Well, let me say, according to some of the reading that I have about people who have, as you call it in some cases, early resignations or quiet resignations, that sort of thing, that certainly is on their list of things. Better compensation, better growth opportunities is very, very important to people. No question about it.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it's all that surprising that is what people are looking after. But it is interesting, I think, when you see how the pandemic played with that and how remote work and the interesting labor market and supply demand kind of enabled that negotiation power. And in tech specifically, especially with software developers during the pandemic, they had an incredible amount of bargaining power because there was just incredibly high demand for software developers specifically. And I've been following as well since the pandemic. Obviously, a lot of my research, a lot of new developments have happened since my research, including all the massive layoffs we've seen in tech. And there is a little bit of shifting, I think, the negotiation power back from employee to the employer. But that being said, we also are still seeing hybrid work persist, even beyond that. Even with all these massive layoffs, hybrid work is still quite popular. So I don't know, if I were to make a prediction, I would say it's still around to stay for a while. I don't know if remote work will be here forever. But if I were to predict, I'd say it's going to be a while, and the future of it will really heavily be impacted by Gen Z and also Gen Alpha as they enter the workforce. Well,
another way of looking at it is that I think the pandemic perhaps got people an opportunity to release, or for workers to find out that these are some of the hidden desires of the employees. Better compensation, treat me well, opportunity to grow that perhaps had not been looked at as part of the regular workforce growth opportunities there.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's interesting because that Great Resignation movement, it wasn't just happening in the U.S., although I would say it probably started in the U.S. and it's still kind of going on there. If you've seen what's happening with Starbucks employees and unionizing there, it's still going on. But it is also happening on a global scale as well. There's definitely some movements of the Great Resignation over here in the UK and in Europe and in China. There is this whole lay flat movement. The working culture over in Asian countries can be a little bit more extreme, even more extreme than it is in the U.S. Because again, it's all a scale, right? So from my perspective and where I sit on the cultural scale towards values of work, I would say that Asian working cultures are a little bit more extreme, and they are often not uncommon to see someone over there napping at their desk. I recently saw an ad for a desk chair that turned into a bed. And it's almost a sign of honor if you're napping at your desk. It means you're a really, really hard worker. Whereas over here, we'd say oh, that's crazy. You're napping at your desk, go home. You need to take more rest. But that Great Resignation, it was global. And I saw it affecting all different cultures, even with different attitudes towards work and different cultures. The Great Resignation was global.
Okay. Well, Amelia, as we begin to wind down, if some of our listeners are considering, also like you did, to want to work in a foreign nation, what are some of let's say, the top 3 things that you would advise them to do to prepare themselves for that journey?
Top 3 things to do before going to work in a foreign nation. I would say, number 1, make sure you familiarize yourself with some culture theory, understand different communication models and how those affect different cultures. Is it high context, low context? How direct should you be? How does this culture view time? Do you need to be right on time, or can you be late? A great resource for that is The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. Great book. She also has a personal culture tool. So number 2, I would suggest you use personal culture tool to understand your personal culture and where that falls. Interestingly enough, when I took my personal cultural tool about a year after moving here to the UK, I found that my personal culture has shifted a bit, and I am a little bit in the middle between the US and the UK. So where I fall on the communication scale, for instance, not quite as low context as the U.S., but nor am I quite as high context as the UK. I'm somewhere in the middle. So understanding your personal culture of how you communicate in relation to the country you're from and the country you're visiting is incredibly important. So that would be number 2. And then number 3, I would say you need to connect with some locals, meet some professionals in the area. There are definitely different ways that you can connect with locals through, social media, online groups, your own professional network. I think it's really important to create a community in the local area that you're going, so you can get the local perspective, which will be so much richer and so much more understanding than just being a tourist in a location. So again, those 3 things that people can do. They can understand culture theory, do a little research on Erin Meyer and Gert Hofstede. Number 2, they can understand their personal culture. How do you communicate, and how does that relate to the culture you're going to? And number 3, they can meet with someone local, understand them, and kind of get to know a little local flavor. And if you're coming to London, I may not be a native Londoner, but I am still local, and I would be more than happy to continue the conversation with anyone over a coffee chat or even over email.
Well, good. Well, thank you so very much. My guest today has been Amelia Meckham, and she joined us from London, England. And it was a great opportunity to listen and benefit from your experience of having worked in London and Germany, and the benefits that you've shared with our listeners today. So I really, really appreciate your coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks again, Peter.
Okay. And to my listeners, if you've enjoyed the show, we'd certainly like to get a great review from you. If you'd like to get in touch with us to let us know about some topics you have that you think we should cover, go to the Public Relations Review Podcast website, drop us a note, and we'll certainly get back to you. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening, and join us for the next edition of the Public Relations Review Podcast.
This podcast is produced by Communication Strategies, an award-winning public relations and public affairs firm headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, this is Peter Woolfolk speaking. Now, first of all, thank you so very much for listening to the podcast. Now, I am very excited to let you know that the podcast is now available on Amazon Alexa. You know the drill. Simply say, Alexa, play Public Relations Review Podcast, and she'll take it from there. And again, thank you for listening. And if you enjoy the program, please become a subscriber. Now, on to the podcast.